Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Now, let's be clear today. Today, I rise on behalf of the good constituents of Elizabeth. Today, we are here to debate, Mr. Speaker, the Road Traffic Amendment Bill that in general terms, Mr. Speaker, aims to provide laws governing the following 4 areas. Require liability insurance for Bahamian vehicle operators, impose certain seatbelt and car seat requirements, provides a framework for the violations of driving under the influence, and prescribes situations in which a car accident, the driver is not required to call the police. Mr. Speaker, these are notable amendments. However, we, especially here in Nassau, and especially the constituents that I represent in Elizabeth, feel the impact, Mr. Speaker, of a poorly planned and enacted road improvement project. Mr. Speaker, this is an infrastructure project that has caused much inconvenience to Bahamians, suffering financial loss to thousands and thousands of residents in this country. Mr. Speaker, the road improvement project started out poorly, with the closures and significant disruptions on the Blue Hill Road and Market Street areas. Mr. Speaker, it is well documented how many businesses and residents were severely inconvenienced, resulting in scores of businesses closing, directly putting pressure on the unemployment in this country, Mr. Speaker. You see, Mr. Speaker, this government did not learn from its mistakes, but instead made things worse for Bahamians the island over. Mr. Speaker, I am informed, and it is my opinion, that because of political pressure and poor public relations, this F&M government made the conscious decision to double the amount of corridors being worked on at any one time, providing tremendous inconvenience, Mr. Speaker, and financial peril to thousands of Bahamians across Nassau. Mr. Speaker, the method in which this F&M government went about its attempt to accelerate this road infrastructure project is evidence of a government choosing politics over its people. This was an all-out assault, Mr. Speaker, on the Bahamian people and their businesses. But at what cost, Mr. Speaker? The F&M government is not being completely honest with the Bahamian people on what the cost of this project will be and how long it will take. Mr. Speaker, we have all witnessed instances where newly paved roads have to be dug up.
Point of order, honourable member for Marco City.
The member of parliament for Elizabeth cannot be allowed to say that the government is not being completely honest, because you're either being honest or you're being dishonest. And so he has got to prove that the government is not being honest about the cost of the road project. That's not right. He should withdraw that or prove.
Honourable member, yes, you have to provide proof or withdraw.
Mr. Speaker, certainly I could have my opinion, and it is of my opinion that the public disclosure of the costs of this project are not completely honest,
okay,
and that the cost of the project is significantly more.
You withdrew the first statement.
I withdrew the first statement, and I replace it with, it is my opinion that this government is not being completely honest with the Bahamian people on the cost of this project. And it is also my opinion, Mr. Speaker, that this F&M government is not being completely honest with the Bahamian people on how long they will be inconvenienced by this road improvement project. Government corporations, Mr. Speaker, such as BEC, have publicly stated that they were not properly consulted, resulting in the possibility that in the very near future, Mr. Speaker, the roads may have to be dug up to accommodate future expansion of utilities. Mr. Speaker, what is the additional cost to Bahamians for this mismanagement, and what appears to be the inadequate implementation of this infrastructure project? Mr. Speaker, the IDB published a program on its website to provide at least $15 million in additional funding for the road improvement project. Is this an accurate figure? Is this going to be enough money? What are the current cost overruns, Mr. Speaker? And what is the expected cost overruns, Mr. Speaker, by the end of this project? Mr. Speaker, I ask, could the cost overruns be in the range of 1/3 of the contract price? How much more than the $120 million will the Bahamian people be forced to pay back to the IDB for this road infrastructure project, Mr. Speaker? These are all unanswered questions that the Bahamians deserve to know. After all, it is their money that's paying for this poorly managed and executed infrastructure project. Mr. Speaker, also, given the tremendous inconvenience experienced day by day by Bahamians, this government should be honest on when it anticipates the completion of this project to be. First it was November, then it was January, now it's this vague first quarter of next year number. What is the truth, Mr. Speaker? Because as it looks to me, this road project won't be completed until long after the PLP becomes the next government of the Bahamas, which is only a few months away. Mr. Speaker, the longer this project takes, the more delays that there are in this project, the more Bahamians must suffer in their day-to-day lives. The more businesses will go out of business, and the more numbers will be added to the unemployed in the Bahamas. So I ask, Mr. Speaker, what is the true anticipated completion date of this project? Be honest. Be straightforward. The Bahamian people deserve to know. Mr. Speaker, unlike most in this honorable place, I can personally speak to the devastating nature and complete disregard to Bahamians and their businesses during this project. From what seemed like months, Robinson Road was closed, Mr. Speaker, essentially shutting down businesses all across that road.
It was months.
Mr. Speaker, this happened throughout the Bahamas with no regard or consultation. Mr. Speaker, I can also speak firsthand regarding the challenges and complete disregard for Bahamians during the roadwork process in the east, and specifically on Prince Charles Drive, which I point out, Mr. Speaker, just happens to be the dividing line between the Elizabeth constituency and the Fox Hill constituency. Two areas represented by this side of the chamber, the Progressive Liberal Party. Mr. Speaker, I personally attended the various meetings that the Ministry of Works held throughout the area. And I must add, these meetings, in my opinion, they were not done for the right reasons. They were not done to truly consult the residents and the businesses in the area, Mr. Speaker. In my opinion, these public meetings, so they say, were a public relations exercise to provide certain political cover, Mr. Speaker, for the government to a poorly administered roadworks project. And let me explain why this is my opinion, Mr. Speaker, why I believe this to be the case, where this government, in this exercise as well, chose politics over people. I remember, Mr. Speaker, the very first meeting where the discussion on the roadworks on the Prince Charles Corridor was held, where representatives from the Ministry of Works presented their plan and asked for input of the residents in the area. And I remember, Mr. Speaker, quite clearly that one of my constituents, they recommended, instead of closing Prince Charles, because at the time they had to dig the center lane up to lay the water pipes, that instead of closing Prince Charles, that the sides be graded so traffic could flow on the outside, because Prince Charles was going to turn into a 4-lane road. And I said, you know, this is a rather logical and reasonable request by one of my constituents, to keep the traffic flowing while the workers could work on the center. Now, the representatives from the Ministry of Works, yes, they were very receptive to this idea. And they said, you know what, we're going to take this back to the minister and the higher-ups within the ministry. So we walked away from that meeting saying, wow, maybe, just maybe, our concerns and our recommendations would be heard. But clearly this government, Mr. Speaker, was not understanding as those working for the Ministry of Works at that meeting, as none of the suggestions, Mr. Speaker, in my opinion, were even considered. The very next day, Mr. Speaker.
Honourable Member for Lucaya.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. It is most unfortunate that the member seeks to mislead the public, presenting what he considers would have transpired without any knowledge at all. You know, you don't have to tell untruths to make your point.
What untruth? What is that? Yeah, what is that?
There's no untruth there, Mr. Speaker. I was very clear. I said, in my opinion, it appeared that the government did not take any consideration of the recommendations of the residents. And why was that? Because, Mr. Speaker, the very next day, Prince Charles was closed and the asphalt was being dug up. Complete disregard for the residents of Elizabeth and the surrounding areas, Mr. Speaker. And I will speak for my constituents today. You better believe that. Mr. Speaker, to make matters worse, this government proceeded with the closing of Prince Charles Drive without proper consultation with the area businesses. And we have big businesses, medium businesses, and small businesses along Prince Charles Corridor. Blanco Bleach, Superwash, Robin Hood, just to name a few, and employing many constituents in my constituency, Mr. Speaker. Robin Hood, for example, Mr. Speaker, just weeks after opening their multi-million-dollar store, employing dozens in my constituency, had to close its doors. Mr. Speaker, because of the lack of cooperation by this F&M government in conducting this roadwork exercise, many of my constituents are now unemployed when they had work before Prince Charles was dug up. And they tell me, Mr. Speaker, every day, how could this F&M government do this to us? How could they send hundreds of us home and put on the unemployment lines? Mr. Speaker, a fundamental component of the roadworks on Prince Charles and an element, Mr. Speaker, that directly affect hundreds of my constituents in Elizabeth is the road redirection after the closure of Prince Charles. At the very first public meeting, Mr. Speaker, I personally made recommendations on the road redirection to protect the safety of my constituents. Now, all of us who have driven in the east, Mr. Speaker, are very familiar with the road redirection. Off Prince Charles Drive, you turn down Beatrice, crossing through Seabreeze Lane, up the Fox Hill Road, and then whichever way you're going from Fox Hill Road. This redirection, Mr. Speaker, posed multiple safety concerns to the residents of Elizabeth. All that I raised during that initial meeting and subsequent meeting with the Ministry of Works. And in my opinion, all of my recommendations were ignored. Mr. Speaker, the redirection of this road resulted in an exponential increase in traffic down Seabreeze Lane. I personally raised the concerns, Mr. Speaker, and made a few recommendations to this road redirection. Mr. Speaker, I recommended, instead of redirecting all of the traffic down Seabreeze Lane through a residential neighborhood, that maybe the traffic be split, with maybe half going down Seabreeze Lane and the other half going around Joe Farrington Road. This would minimize the traffic flow in any concentrated area, Mr. Speaker. The increase in the traffic volume, Mr. Speaker, exclusively down Seabreeze Lane, raised concerns about increase in crime, such as property theft to residents in the area, but also, Mr. Speaker, raised significant concerns from my constituents regarding the safety of the residents in the area, and particularly the children who may be playing close to the road. Because you see, Mr. Speaker, this redirection goes straight through a residential neighborhood where there are young families throughout, with kids are playing in the yard after school and on weekends. The recommendation, Mr. Speaker, to split the traffic to Joe Farrington Road was intended to address some of these concerns, these safety concerns, by mitigating some of the traffic that goes directly through the residential neighborhood. Mr. Speaker, at the meetings, the representatives from the Ministry of Works, again, were very receptive and said they would deliver the recommendations to the higher-ups within the ministry. But, Mr. Speaker, nothing came of these recommendations. The concerns of the residents of Elizabeth, in my opinion, were totally ignored, Mr. Speaker, again, putting politics above people. Mr. Speaker, again, I expressed similar concerns regarding Sandilands Village Road. You see, Seabreeze Lane has speed bumps, but Sandilands Village Road at the time did not. And the residents of Sandilands Village Road, Mr. Speaker, were quite concerned about the traffic that would become on a diversion from Seabreeze Lane down Sandilands Village Road, causing a high volume of traffic through Sandilands Village Road, a narrower road than Seabreeze Lane, and again, right through the heart of a residential community. And without speed bumps, Mr. Speaker, anybody who has driven through Sandilands Village Road knows that before the speed bumps, it was like the Indy 500. Cars racing up and down the street, posing dangerous situations for residents and children alike. At every single public meeting, Mr. Speaker, and with private correspondence to the Ministry of Works, I recommended that speed bumps be placed on Sandilands Village Road from the very beginning of the road diversion, because I had foreshadowed, Mr. Speaker, that this might happen. Initially, Mr. Speaker, these recommendations had to have been ignored because no speed bumps were forthcoming. Mr. Speaker, we even discussed with Ministry of Works representatives stationing a police officer at the access road to Sandilands Village Road to ensure that traffic flowed properly and efficiently. This recommendation, Mr. Speaker, seems to obviously also been ignored. It wasn't, Mr. Speaker, until there was a series of car accidents, some causing injury to people and damage to property down Sandilands Village Road, that this government decided it was prudent to put in speed bumps. Mr. Speaker, a government choosing politics ahead of the safety of its people. Again, Mr. Speaker, this was well received by the Ministry of Work representatives at the various meetings. But for some reason, this government did not have that pedestrian walkway installed. I made this recommendation, Mr. Speaker, to no fewer than 2 cabinet ministers and the permanent secretary. Mr. Speaker, much to my surprise, when Doris Johnson High School opened this term, there was no pedestrian walkway for the children, as we had requested for the protection of them, and they walked to school. In fact, Mr. Speaker, the students, and we observed this, me and the member from Fox Hill observed this in person. Students at the opening of school had to walk through an active construction zone, dodging heavy machinery, walking around and through ditches, right in front of the school. Mr. Speaker, walking over mounds of dirt just to get to the school. Mr. Speaker, the dangers to the students as a result of the negligent development of Prince Charles Drive placed hundreds of children at risk for their safety. Clearly, Mr. Speaker, this is another example of choosing politics over people. But, Mr. Speaker, don't take my word for it. I am sure, Mr. Speaker, that many Bahamians, and specifically constituents in Elizabeth, heard the Minister of State for Finance, the member of Marco City, on the news last night. When discussing the roadworks, Mr. Speaker, in his usual manner, he was very dismissive of the Bahamian people, essentially saying, Mr. Speaker, that those who have suffered during this roadwork project are a byproduct, as they believe the quality of life of Bahamians will improve. Mr. Speaker, those who live in Elizabeth, those who lost their jobs as a result of the mismanagement of this road project, those businesses who have closed or possibly suffered irreparable damage, I ask the Bahamian people, are you comforted by the fact that your quality of life might improve? I think not. Mr. Speaker, and to the member from Marco City, shame on you to address the Bahamian people and the constituents of Elizabeth in that fashion. People are genuinely hurting, Mr. Speaker, because of this government's negligent actions. I ask you, show some compassion to the Bahamian people. Show some compassion to those that you put out of work. Show some compassion to the business owners that you put out of business. See, Mr. Speaker, that interview last night was a clear indication of choosing politics over people by this F&M government. And to the residents of Elizabeth, this government tells you, just too bad. Your suffering is just a byproduct, and you should accept it. I say, as your member of parliament and representative, you deserve better. You deserve a government who cares, a government that governs in your best interest. Now, Mr. Speaker, I couldn't help but today, in reading the sports section of the Nassau Guardian, because there's a lot of road improvement projects related to the new sports stadium. And we are all waiting in anticipation of its completion and to see the international events held in this sports stadium. But Mr. Speaker, and I'll adopt this as my own, I read today in the Guardian sports section, the new Thomas A. Robinson National Stadium isn't even completed as yet, and already the Bahamas is forced to withdraw from 2 major sporting events. The most recent one, the 2014 IAAF World Junior Championships. I ask, we're investing all of this in this stadium and the ancillary road works around it. We are still canceling international events in 2014, 2 of them now, that is supposed to help finance this stadium. That's reminiscent, Mr. Speaker, of Carafesta and the reasons that we had on canceling that as well. We have to do better, Mr. Speaker, and if we are investing hundreds of millions of dollars in infrastructure projects like this, we have to have some assurances that it will pay off, that it will be in the best interest of Bahamians, that it is money well spent, Mr. Speaker. Earlier today, Mr. Speaker, we heard from my colleague from Engliston discuss the specifics of this legislation. And Mr. Speaker, I did want to take the opportunity to raise a practical question to a component of this legislation. The sections that address when police officers are not required to be present at minor traffic accidents, Mr. Speaker. And Mr. Speaker, the minister explained today how insurance companies demand and request police reports on satisfying claims. And he hopes that they will no longer have to do this, I guess. But Mr. Speaker, in order to honor claims, it is in the course of business in the insurance industry to have these police reports, partly to be able to determine who is at fault. See, we're not a no-fault jurisdiction like other jurisdictions. And insurance companies, in the way they do business, have to determine fault, or is there industry practice to do so? But I understand the efficiencies that are accomplished by this piece of legislation, and in minor accidents, not having to take police off of the beat in other places to come to these. So I just want to ask, practically, is this going to cause a real-life practical problem in insurance claims? How do we get around this? Has there any consultation with the insurance industry to see if this is an area, a piece in this legislation that could work from a practical day-to-day point of view? I don't know. I just asked the question. And Mr. Speaker, with respect to the liability insurance, we again can understand the practicality of requiring third-party liability. But has there been any consultation or evaluation of the cost of this? I heard the member from Garden Hills say it's just going to be $25 more. Is that $25 a month? Is that $25 6 months, every year? Has the industry, the insurance industry, been consulted? I mean, is that a number we can rely on? I just asked the question because I think that the Bahamian people, especially those with ACT insurance, just should know what they should anticipate. So, Mr. Speaker, in conclusion, I just want to reiterate that the management of this road infrastructure project has been nothing but negligence by this F&M government. Delays upon delays, cost overruns, Mr. Speaker, that in my opinion and theoretically could pay for temporary jobs maybe twice over. Hundreds of Bahamians who own businesses either shut down or irreparably damaged. Increased crime, Mr. Speaker, in areas where there's traffic diversions. And, Mr. Speaker, frustrations to thousands of Bahamians and risks to the safety of Bahamians. All this, Mr. Speaker, the responsibility of this F&M government. See, Mr. Speaker, when a government undertakes such projects as this, it is to do so with the responsibility of being as least disruptive as possible to the well-being of Bahamians. Mr. Speaker, this government did not do this. This government believes in politics above people. This government decided to put Bahamians in hardship in hope to being in a position to win a general election. But, Mr. Speaker, this won't work. The people, and specifically the constituents of Elizabeth, will remember how you treated them. will remember how you turned their back on them, will remember how you caused discomfort to them in pursuit of winning a general election. Thank you for your indulgence, Mr. Speaker.
As many